Today, we're back here again in Pittsburgh, and today the feast of St. Paul, the first hermit, and a few considerations. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost, amen. St. Paul was inspired he was about 13 years old, or maybe 16 at the oldest, when there was a persecution in Africa. And he decided to go into the desert to find God. He went into the desert. Perhaps he was going to go only for a short time, but he went into the desert and he discovered that in the desert there is Christ. In the desert there is peace. There's something sacred about the desert. You know that when God created the world, at the time of the creation there was originally no desert. And when he created the world, it was filled with green all around. There was no winter. There was no harsh summer. There were no 4 seasons, only maybe a slight rainy season where there would be a moistness in the air, and a drier season, but not totally dry. And the whole world was like a perfect tropical type of a climate before the flood. And God sent a punishment. And we see an interesting thing about the punishment of God, that God was angry with the world. He was angry with the world because of its sin. And he spoke to Noah, and he said, I am angry with man. I have repented myself that I have made man. For he has filled the earth with sin. He was supposed to go and people the earth, and he went around the earth, but instead he was filled with sin. And so, therefore, he would send water to wipe away the sin of man. And when he sent water, and only the 8 people survived the flood, Noah, his 3 sons, and their wives, and then 2 of each of the animals. And after the flood, the world changed. And it's interesting the things that happened after the flood. One of them, the fathers tell us, that before the flood, there was no wine. It was only grape juice. Before the flood, there was grape juice. You could have Welch's grape juice, but you couldn't have any wine. And this is the reason why Noah got drunk. He was not guilty of the sin of drunkenness. He just liked grape juice. And he made several gallons of grape juice, and he drank the grape juice. Tasted better than he had remembered before the flood. And the next thing you know, he was lying naked on the ground. And he was drunk. And so Ham came and saw him drunk, and he laughed. He went and told his brothers, Japheth and Sem. And they would not look upon the nakedness of their father, but they walked backwards with a cloak, that they would not see the nakedness of their father, and covered him with a cloak. And when Noah woke from his drunkenness, he cursed Canaan, the son of Ham, because he had mocked him. So the world changed after the flood. The anger of God made grape juice turn into wine. Later on, what would be said about that wine? Later on, it would be said about that wine by David in his Psalms, Vinum laetificet cor hominis. Wine rejoices the heart of man. He created 4 seasons, which didn't exist before. He created deserts. He created high mountains filled with snow. He created the fall and the spring. And it's interesting what God does when he's angry. The snow is most beautiful and magnificent. The desert has incredible kinds of life in it. And the desert is amazing what God has done in the desert. That in the desert we find the cactus. In the desert we find various desert animals. In the desert there is great beauty. In the mountains that didn't exist before the flood, there were small mountains before the flood, but the great mountains of the Alps, the great mountains of the Himalayas and of the Rockies and the Andes, these mountains didn't exist. They could not be climbed before the flood. And one of the things that was created as a punishment was the desert. When you go out of the desert, you die. There is no water. And yet, we discover the mystery of the punishment of God. When God is angry, he took grape juice and he turned it into wine. And if you have any brains and you like grape juice better than you like wine, you need to have your head examined and you need to see a doctor. When God was angry, he turned grape juice into wine. And not only he turned it into wine, without wine, on which Noah got drunk, the first man to ever get drunk in the history of the world. There, without wine, there's no Mass. Without wine, there's no sacrifice of the Mass. Without wine, there's no body and blood and the soul and divinity of Christ present on the altar today. And so this is what God does when He's angry with man. He is so filled with goodness. He's so filled with the wonderful, infinite goodness inside of Him that when He's angry, He makes things better. He makes things more beautiful. And we begin to see in the 4 seasons, as opposed to the 2 seasons that were before, we begin to see in the new kind of topography on the earth, such as the incredible wildness of the desert and the incredible height and coldness of the mountains, that God has made something mirabilius. That's what we'll say in the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass. Mirabilius. He made something more wonderful. He made the world wonderful and magnificent. He got angry and He rearranged things. And what He rearranged was more beautiful than what He had made before. And so it is also that wine made it possible for us to have Mass. It didn't exist before the flood. And then we have a desert. Man is a social creature. Man is meant to be with others. Man can't be without water. And the most terrible thing that ever approaches man is great heat. The great heat of the fire of hell. And we find no water in the desert. We find great heat in the desert. We find the killing of life in the desert. And one day, the history of the church was changed. Because 1,700 years ago, a young man named Paul, not St. Paul of Tarsus, but Paul of Egypt, one man named Paul decided to go in the desert. To go in the desert by himself. He went in the desert by himself and he changed history. He went in the desert by himself and he changed the world. And a movement came. He was the first one to go in the desert. 3 years later, the most famous of all would go in the desert, named Anthony, who would fight hand to hand with the devil. The one that St. Anthony of Padua is named after was the great Anthony of the desert. 3 years after Paul went into the desert, Anthony went in the desert. And then there became this movement. And it's interesting about this movement, you know that I am called Father. You call me Father. And you call all priests Father. The first time this word Father was begun to be used in the church was the fathers of the desert. They were not even priests, most of them. They were fathers. They went out in the desert and they attached themselves to the heat. They attached themselves to the rocks. They attached themselves to penance. They attached themselves to be away from men. They didn't want to be near men, but only near God. And they went out in the desert. And in the desert, they found the divine love. In the desert, they found the depth of the gospel. When you find water in the desert, it's almost a miracle. And they found water in the desert. And Paul was the first one, St. Paul, the first hermit. He went out into that desert. He didn't tell anyone. He just did it. He ran out in the desert. And Anthony was inspired. And he ran out into the desert. And Anthony was the greatest of all the hermits who followed St. Paul. And Anthony was in the desert by himself, and he prayed to God. And he was alone. How is that a threat to the devil? But his prayers shook the whole of the church. His prayers shook the world. And St. Paul was in another part of that desert in Africa. And there they were in the desert, and they prayed, and they did penance, and they communed with God. And the kingdom of hell was shaken. And it began at the very end of the time of persecution, around the year 300. And it began around that time, and they went out into the desert when the visible persecution stopped, and then the desert became the place of saints. The saints before that, they were martyred. These saints would become saints by having the divine love inside of their hearts, inside of the desert. And they would learn how the gospel works. They would learn how to form souls, how to overcome anger, how to overcome impurity, how to overcome pride, how to overcome all each of the sins, how to make the whole world designed for God, how to find God. And they realized there's something sacred about the desert. The desert was created by God as a punishment for sin. As one of the many punishments, He made the Jews wander 40 years in a desert. And our Lord Jesus Christ himself, though, before he began his most sacred ministry of saving our souls and preaching the divine truth, he went out into the desert for 40 days. 40 days he was in that desert. And in the desert, he did not eat of the food of men. And he ate only of the food of God. And at the end of the 40th day, the devil tempted him, and he waged the greatest war that could ever be waged of temptation. Christ against the devil after 40 days in the desert. And St. Paul would wage that war. And St. Anthony would wage that war. And all of us have to wage a war against the devil. We're in the desert of this world. And they recognize this world is a desert. This world is a world in which the life of God is stifled out. The water of grace is dried up. And we're going to go into what the world calls a desert, and we're going to find the water of the divine grace. We're going to find the life of God, and we're going to fight the devil in hand-to-hand combat. And that's what St. Paul did. 103 years he was a hermit. 103 years. Whereas St. Anthony, he was a wimp. He was only a hermit for 100 years. And how St. Anthony was a hermit for 100 years. 100 years in the desert fighting the devil. 100 years in the desert speaking to God. 100 years in the desert eating of the locusts, eating of almost nothing, doing penance, and considering the wonder and magnificence of the Holy Gospel, and the love that was in the heart of St. Paul, and the love that was in the heart of St. Anthony, reached out into the world. And people came into the desert. Where is Paul? I don't know. Go in the desert. His heart is like a magnet. And the heart of Anthony is like a magnet. Go into the desert and you will find Anthony. Go into the desert and you will find Paul. Paul the first one, Anthony the greatest. And they went especially to Anthony. And they went also to Paul. And they went into that desert and they said, Abba, how do I fight sin? Abba, how do I love God? Abba, how do I be a Catholic in this world after the persecution of the Romans had ceased? How do I do it? And they taught them how. And they were called Father. And we began to use the word Father for those that teach us how to fight the devil. For those that teach us how to grow in the divine life. And so Father was later on applied, or on the same time, I guess, or it was applied also to priests, called Father. And so we are called Father, and our fatherhood comes in part from our priesthood, which is that we are the offerers of the sacrifice of Mass. We are the carriers of Christ from heaven to the earth, and this earth is a desert. And we have to go out into a desert. We go out into a desert separated from the world. And this is what all must do. St. Paul went physically into the desert. St. Anthony went physically into the desert 1,700 years ago, and they waged the greatest war. Anthony, the devil was so terrified of Anthony, he tried to destroy Anthony. He tried to destroy St. Paul. And they built the first foundation of Christendom. Remember, our kingdom, the kingdom of the victory of Christ, is not built like the rest of the world. It isn't built like the rest of the world. It has a different foundation. Paul ran away, and then he found the glory of the desert. Anthony ran into the desert and found the glory of the desert. And in the desert, they found all truth. In the desert, they found all love. In the desert, they found the deepest understanding of the gospel. And then others came to them and said, all right, how do I go out? How do I learn about the gospel? Well, you remember, the Jews had to wander 40 years in the desert, and then they crossed into the promised land. Christ, 40 days in the desert, and then he preached his Sermon on the Mount. And then, of course, we find the desert of this world. We have to fight in this desert before we're going to conquer Christ. Before we're going to conquer Satan and be conquerors with Christ. There's something sacred about this holy desert. And we've been in a desert for the last 300 years where Rome has been trying to destroy Christianity, trying to destroy the Catholic faith, but it has failed. And we come out of the desert. When Christ came out of the desert after 40 days, he came a warrior.